1001 Arabian Nights by Geraldine McCaughrean. Chapter 1. The Marriage of Shahrazad. Stories are carried from the desert kingdoms of India and Persia and Arabia, but who can tell if they are true? Of the twin kingdoms of Sassan and Samarkand al-Ajam. Their rulers were brothers, the tall and glorious King Shahryar and his smaller brother King Shahrazad. The foundations of their cities and palaces were not moved by the shifting ocean of Arabian sand. Their domes and minarets on a horizon were as beautiful in the eyes of desert travelers as foaming water or banked rain clouds. Just as his cities were wonderful to the eyes, so the young Shahryar was wonderful in the eyes of his people, for he ruled wisely and generously. The heart of Shahryar was lovely, for he took pleasure in the life that Allah gave him. Above all, Shahryar took pleasure in his wife, a lady as lovely as the moon reflected in lily pools. Only the queen of King Shahrazad, his brother, equaled her in beauty. One morning King Shahryar took it into his heart to visit his brother in the kingdom of Samarkand al-Ajam, and called for camels to be mustered and loaded with presents. Bales of damask cloth, flasks of attar of roses, and panniers filled with oriental spices were heaped across their camels until their legs bent like an archer's bow. In the inner chamber of his palace, King Shahryar kissed his lovely wife goodbye, and, of course, veiled her face, so that no other man but the king should accidentally glimpse her beauty. The streets of the royal city of Sassan were filled with the fragrance as the caravan wound its way from the palace to the eastern gates. Just as they were leaving the city, King Shahryar remembered the small personal gift of red sulphur he had laid ready in his bedroom, intending to carry it to King Shahrazad. He hurried back to his palace alone and climbed the stairs, his calfskin shoes making no sound on the stone staircase. As he opened the bedroom door, his heart jumped inside him like a startled hare. In one moment it leapt with delight at the sight of his wife's face, and in the next it leapt with anger that her veil was gone. A servant from the palace stables was sitting beside the queen. In one hand he held the crumpled veil, and in the other he held the queen's hand. When King Shahryar rejoined his caravan of camels, he wore his unhappiness like a black woolen cloak. He stooped under its weight. No word passed his lips until he reached the royal city of Samarkand al-Ajam, the home of King Shahrazad, his brother. The distant city walls trembled like a mirage, for his eyes were still full of tears. An old man, richly dressed, came out of the gates toward them, making small and weary gestures of welcome, as though his strength was not equal to his message. But as they drew closer to one another, King Shahryar recognized his own young brother, wearing his grief like old age. His body was like a tent smothered by a sandstorm as it bowed under the weight of his unhappiness. "Put faith in no one but Allah," said Shahrazad, pressing his forehead against his brother's shoulder. "There is such wickedness in the world." They walked away from the whispering of camel drivers and grunting of the camels to share their secret in the shadow of the city wall. "Who can I tell but you, brother?" whispered Shahrazad, looking around him for fear of being overheard. "My wife has taken my love and emptied it into a pool of mud. She has uncovered her face in front of the palace cook, and shined on him with her eyes and waited on him with her hands. Oh, Shahryar, you cannot know what good fortune you have in your lovely, loving wife." At the sound of his brother's words, King Shahryar, king of all Sassan, let it not be spoken twice, wept salt tears. "Oh, Shahrazad, I wish I had married a camel on my wedding day. My wife has uncovered her face in front of a stable boy and shined on him with her eyes and waited on him with her hands, and I killed them both this morning with my own sword." Shahrazad held his head and cried aloud, "My wife and the palace cook were put to death this morning. What shall we do, brother? It is what the poet says. Women are worthless, women are liars, they seem to be roses, but grow into briars. All women are fickle." So night fell in the hearts of King Shahzaman of Samarkand al-Ajam and King Shahryar of Sassan. When Shahryar returned to his city, a pall of sadness settled over all the people of Sassan for 3 long years. Sadness crept like a spy into the rib-cage of young King Shahryar. It snuffed out all his candles of joy and left his heart to blunder about in utter darkness. Unhappiness crept to the back door of his heart and unlocked it, letting in the enemies of Allah, doubt and harshness, and fear. Yes, let it not be spoken twice. The tall, valiant, and courteous king of all Sassan was afraid. At night, when his courtiers were in bed and his maid-servants were sleeping, the candles in his chamber trembled with loneliness, and the black tent of night flapped around his heart. The creases of the empty pillow beside his head made faces at him, and the faces reminded him of his wife. Then, hitting the pillow with his fist, he vowed to hide the pillow's creases under a new head. "Wazir!" he shouted. "Fetch my wazir!" The king wazir, his sole adviser, ran to the king Shahryar's bedchamber, bleary with sleep, and kissed the hem of the bedspread. "I will not spend another night alone in this bed," shouted the king. The wazir clapped his hands with joy. "Oh, you wish to marry again, most courteous and mighty king. All Sassan will delight in the news." "How can I marry again?" Shahryar stormed, "when all women are faithless and none of them will love a man for more than a day?" "No one could love the magnificence of your lordship for less than 1,000 years," said the wazir, shaking with fright. "I know that women are fickle. If anyone dares to dispute it, I'll have him fed to the palace dogs in pieces for a week and then put him to death myself." "All women are fickle," said the wazir, who had a certain store of wisdom. "It is perfectly obvious what I must do," said King Shahryar, recovering his just and even temper, renowned throughout Sassan. "Fetch me a pretty, talented girl at once, and I will marry her this morning." "I will, sir, with all my heart, sir," said the wazir, anxious only to be gone. But with one word the glorious young king stopped his wazir at the door. "Worthy old man," he said, "invite the executioner to the wedding, and furnish a room for him inside the palace. I shall behead my new bride tomorrow morning before she can stop loving me. Fetch another young woman to me after the execution, and I shall marry again. While the executioner's sword is sharp, I need never be alone at night. Have I not more wisdom than my own wazir in solving this problem?" "With such wisdom, what need have you of me, your miserable wazir?" agreed the wazir, and he crept backwards out of the king's presence. In the corridor outside he was obliged to stop and lean his head against the wall. His heart had turned into a lead anchor which stopped all movement but for the seasick rocking of his soul. And so, for 3 years, the golden ruler of all Sassan married every day 1,000 brides, 1,000 executions, 1,000 spaces in the crowded streets of the bazaar, 2,000 empty sandals, 100,000 pricks of conscience in the heart of the king's wazir. So the stories stay, but who can tell if they are true? The stories also say that the wazir had 2 daughters, Dunyazad and Shahrazad, and that during those 3 dark years in the history of Sassan, Shahrazad, daughter of the daughter of the king's wazir, crossed the river that separates childhood from womanhood. One morning at breakfast, the king's wazir took his beard in both hands and wept salt tears into his pewter dishes. "Dearest father, why are you crying?" his daughters asked. The wazir looked at Dunyazad and her elder sister Shahrazad, and he covered his face with his hands. "Tell us, father," said Shahrazad, "is the dear king ill? Nothing else could make you so unhappy." He shook his head. "I cannot truthfully say that the dear king is ill. Oh, sweet Shahrazad, you know that there is no king more glorious in all the realms of India and Persia and Arabia than King Shahryar, and there is no man more fortunate than I am to be his wazir and to advise him. But there is a matter about which he will not take my advice. My words fall like blown sand on a sleeping traveler. He rises the next morning and brushes my advice away with a wave of his hand." And the wazir recounted the sorrows of the last 3 years. "The dear king has taken the notion into his heart that no woman can be trusted. A woman, he says, will love a man one day and hate him the next. She will marry a man one day and fall in love with his servant the next morning. I cannot convince him that there were many good women among his brides. Many? Brides? Has the king married many times? He marries every day, Shahrazad. His bride keeps him company during the hours of darkness. Let it not be spoken twice, but the valiant king is a little afraid of being alone at night. But the morning after his wedding, the dear, good king has his new wife's head cut off so that she cannot fall in love with anyone else. And it is my task to find him another bride, and another, and another. Poor father, said Shahrazad. Now I understand why the halls and corridors of the palace are so empty. I understand why I see no noble women in the marketplace and so few silken sandals outside the marble mosques. Now I understand why you are weeping. The city is as empty of young women as the sea is empty of drinking water, said the wazir. The dear king has cut off all their heads, but that is not why I was weeping. I must send both of you away today, at once. If the dear king should find out that I have a beautiful daughter of marriageable age, you would have to become his latest wife, and he would not leave you your life the morning after the wedding. Dunyazad began to cry, but Shahrazad covered her face with her veil so that her expression could not be seen. But that is not why I am weeping either, my beloved daughters. There are no more noble women in the city, and I will not empty the kingdom of Sasan of all its young women. When I cannot or will not carry out the orders of the dear king, he will certainly, in his graciousness and wisdom, see fit to put me to death. Dunyazad cried out all the more, but Shahrazad's face was hidden by her veil, and she was silent. Finally she said, Dearest father, if you believe that we shall never meet again after today, you cannot refuse me one favor. I would not refuse you a favor, even if you were not going away, said the wazir. You have never asked me for anything. What would I refuse you? Then marry me to the dear King Shahryar. In this way I will die as a queen, and one less daughter of Sasan will die because of me. Oh, Shahrazad! You are the oasis in the desert of my dry old soul. Do not empty yourself into the king's hands. He will only spill you. Father, do not let your sorrow make you speak without respect for our glorious king. Mention to him that you have a daughter. Please, I beg you, if Allah wills it, our dear king will marry me. King Shahryar, ruler of all Sasan, was delighted with Shahrazad. Her face behind her veil is like the moon behind a cloud, he said to the wazir. Why did you not bring me this one before? She is my daughter, noble king, my beloved daughter. And seeing that the king's heart was already set on a marriage, the wazir covered his face with his arm and left the royal chamber, not staying for the wedding feast which began in the selfsame hour. During the festivities, Shahrazad took her little sister to one side and whispered to her, You know that the dear king, in his graciousness and wisdom, will not cut off my head until the morning. I would like to see a friendly face when I wake. Come to my royal husband's bedroom in the morning. I will come, said Dunyazad. And if you come, perhaps Allah will put it into your heart to say this. And she lifted her sister's dark hair and spoke a few words into her ear. The sound of the king's headsman sharpening his sword in the courtyard woke Shahrazad where she lay in the royal bed. King Shahryar was already awake. Are you ready, wife? If it is time, my gracious husband. But my little sister Dunyazad is knocking on the door. Let me say goodbye to her, and then you may take what joy you can from cutting off my little head. Dunyazad stood on the threshold, her face uncovered, and King Shahryar captured her face in the cage of his memory, thinking to marry her too when she came of age. If you have come to ask for your sister's life to be spared, said the king, I must tell you that it is impossible. A woman's love is as long as a stroke of a pen that has seen no ink. Do not waste your tears. Gracious king, said Dunyazad, bowing to the ground, in your graciousness and wisdom you know what is for the best. But let me say goodbye to my sister, for the swordsman is waiting in the courtyard, and I shall never see her again. The king stood aside. Dunyazad and Shahrazad kissed one another. Dearest sister, said Dunyazad, how we shall miss you, father and I. How we shall miss your voice singing in the garden, your flute playing on the terraces, and the aroma of your cooking. But I know when we shall miss you most of all. The nights will be so long without your wonderful stories. No one in all Arabia can tell stories as you do. The nights will be as empty as the sea is empty of birds. Do you remember how father laughed when you told the story of the everlasting slippers? Do you remember how we all cried when you told the story of the keys of destiny, and how the maidservant almost choked on her dinner when you amazed us with the story language of the animals? I would give up my place among the ladies of this palace just to hear one more story. Won't you tell me one last little story, Shahrazad?" "No, little sister. It is time now. My dear husband the king has many things to do today. I must not keep him waiting. It is a pity, for tonight I would have told you the story of— Oh, no matter." King Shahryar overheard their words. He remembered in his heart how the black tent of night flapped around him when he was alone in the dark. But he said, "You have some of the wisdom of your father, Shahrazad. My days are busy, my courtiers are waiting. No worthless wife must delay court business, and surely every second that passes makes it likely that your life will outlast your love for me. Women's love is only as long as the hairs on a chicken's egg. You can do only one more thing to please me. Give up your head. I can see the swordsman from this window. Hurry down to him, and I will watch from here." In the courtyard the stones underfoot were already hot. Shahrazad bowed to the ground before the king's window, and then she coiled up her hair and bowed low before the king's swordsman. Chapter 2. The Voyage of Sinbad the Sailor. In his heart, King Shahryar pictured the nights of his childhood when his mother told him tales from beyond the furthermost borders of Araby. "One word, Shahrazad," he called from his window. What story were you going to tell to Dunyazad tonight?" "The story of Sinbad the Sailor, dear husband," said Shahrazad as the swordsman placed his foot on her back. "An adventure drawn up from the liquid mountains of the sea, where there are as many wonderful beasts and fabulous islands as there are trees in a forest." "Shahrazad, I have it in my heart to hear the story, but I have affairs of state to attend to. You will tell it to me tonight. Swordsman, come back tomorrow at the very same time." Just as the tent of night began to flap around King Shahryar's heart and set the candles in his eyes trembling with fear, Shahrazad came to his bed and lay down beside him. Leaning on one elbow, she began. "A story is carried from Baghdad, though who can tell if it is true, of a young man called Sinbad the porter. Sinbad was known at all the local inns for his beautiful singing voice, and he would often sing in return for a coin or a bite to eat. He was summoned one day to a great house built of white and wine-colored marble on the skirts of the city. An old man was sitting on the vine-covered terrace and asked him to sing, which he willingly did. "Oh, I have carried golden treasure half across Arabia's sands, and I have seen the cost of pleasure pouring out of rich men's hands. But do not think of me as rich, sir, because I carry treasure chests, for I count myself much richer when I lay them down and rest. I am just a poor young porter. All my meat is caught from the rivers. All the wines I drink are water. All I carry I deliver." The song pleased the old man, and he took a great liking to the porter. "The pleasure a good song gives can't be paid for with money alone," said the old man. "Let me give you something of mine. I shall give you the story of my life, which is moderately interesting. My name is Sinbad too, but I am Sinbad the Sailor. I was born the son of a rich father who died and left me a lot of money. Being a particularly clever boy, I made the sensible decision to invest the money. I invested it in drink and expensive food and stylish clothes, and in buying myself a lot of friends at the local inn. Before long I found that my investment had left me with hardly a penny. To tell you the truth, I did not want to be poor in my old age. So I sold everything I owned and bought instead a silk-sailed ship and cargo. I employed a captain, and we set sail for the rest of the world, turning a furrow through the sea as straight and certain as an arrow through a blue sky. I was confident of making my fortune as a merchant. One day a solitary island came into view from the mast-top, 2 or 3 trees, and a smooth grey beach the colour of the atolls in the great western ocean. Some of the sailors were tired of blood swilling in their veins with the motion of the ship, and we took it into our heads to draw alongside the island and walk about on dry land. The captain was sleeping below decks. We did not trouble to wake him. A friendly fire, a baked fish, a short walk, and we would be ready to set off again. 2 of the men even brought a laundry barrel from the ship to do their washing in. Ali lit a fire, and I made a tour of the island, but there was not a lot to recommend it. We were just deciding that no one could live there without fresh water, when suddenly Abdul caught sight of a fountain, a geyser, rather, at great distance from us. Its water gushed higher and higher, seemingly to the height of a castle tower, and then dropped out of sight. "I have been aboard ship for too long. The ground still seems to be moving," I said, embarrassed by losing my balance and falling over. Then the captain's voice drifted to us on the wind. "Aboard! Aboard! Or you are all dead men!" "The island is sinking!" someone cried. "The island is moving!" shouted another. A deep roaring beneath us was followed by a second eruption of water from the geyser. It spouted so high that the spray reached us on the wind and soaked us to the skin in a second. Amidst the spray I could just see the captain giving orders for the ship to pull away. The space of water opened between our landing party and the vessel. Some men ran to the water and leapt in. Others shouted to the captain, calling him names or begging him to pull ashore again. Only one or two of his words reached us across the opening gap. "Whale! Fire has woken the whale!" Well, you may hold your head in wonder, friend. We had indeed moored alongside a giant whale, and the fire we had lit on its back had disturbed it out of a sleep centuries long. The sandy silt of the ocean had washed over the whale, and the winds had brought seeds and spores and planted its sparse vegetation, but as it rolled in our pain, our fire beginning to burn through its hide and making an awful stench, the shallow-rooted trees were washed away like toothpicks, and the sand swirled round our knees as we stumbled to and fro. The whale dived. One sailor was thrown high out of the water by the massive tail. Believe me, friend, these tail flukes were larger than galleon sails, and the tail fell on us like the greatest tree in all the gum forest of Arabia. To the end of my days I shall weary Allah with my thanks. The barrel full of my fellow sailors' washing rolled towards me across the water. I pulled myself across it and floated away, while my sailor friends swam down with the whale to the kingdom where only the fish can breathe. Friend, it makes me sweat salt water only to think about it. The ship had long since gone. I was alone on the ocean with the smell of scorched whale in my nostrils. I began to paddle with my feet, and my lonely voyage, as you can imagine, was so long and tiring that I do not remember reaching land. I woke up beside my barrel on a white beach to find, to my great surprise, that I was alive. I also found that the fish had eaten many holes in my feet, and only with pain and difficulty did I climb the beach and explore. I saw no one, friend, and nothing. Under the trees, the undergrowth was thick, a perfect home for wild animals. Why else did I climb that tree? But from the topmost branches I could see a long, long way. I saw no one, friend, and nothing. In another direction, however, I glimpsed a shining white dome. Surely it was a fine mosque at the heart of a splendid city. Its white curve seemed so massive that I was almost afraid to approach. When I finally reached it, I walked around it 5 times before I gave up hope of finding a door. Its whiteness was dazzling in the sun. I tried to climb up it, but the white surface was so polished and smooth that I slithered down to the ground again and again. I exhausted myself in the midday heat, and that is why I was sitting on the ground in the shade of the white dome when the sun went dark. I have seen tropical suns set like a single clap of hands. I have seen the moon forget its rightful place and push in front of the sun. But this was no eclipse or sunset. Looking up, I saw that the sun had been blotted out by the shape of a gigantic bird. Its claws were as large as the tusks of elephants, one toe the thickness of a tree trunk. Its wings were as huge as my terror, and its feathers as black as my miserable fate. For now I realized that the white dome I was sitting under was nothing other than the bird's unhatched egg. And as slowly and certainly as a ship on a whirlpool is circling down, the huge bird was wheeling down upon me. "Why have you stopped?" said King Shahryar. "Oh, my dear husband," Shahryar replied, "I am surely the most worthless of wives, for I have wearied you all night with my storytelling, and already it is dawn. Your swordsman is waiting for me in the courtyard. I can hear him sharpening his sword." "But what became of Sinbad the sailor?" Shahryar demanded. "How did he escape being eaten by the bird?" "Oh, dear husband, the things that happened to Sinbad are so strange and so many that I could spend another night in telling you his story." So King Shahryar rose and went to the window and leaned out. "Come back tomorrow, swordsman, at the very same time. And you, Shahrazad," he said, turning to his wife, "you must return this evening to finish the story." "To hear you is to obey," Shahrazad replied. Chapter 3. Sinbad the Sailor, the Valley of Diamonds. On the next night, Shahrazad reclined on one elbow, rested her head in her hand, and continued the story of Sinbad the Sailor. From the well of my memory I drew up the strange and wonderful tales I had heard at Baghdad harbor. I recalled travelers' descriptions of the giant Ruk, a bird whose wingspan half covered the sky. Undoubtedly I was squatting in the shadow of just such a bird, and my only hope of life lay in staying hidden under the egg. A vast, stinking warmth enveloped me as the Ruk settled over her egg, and I found myself somewhere between the clawed feet, a pouch of bird down pressing on my head with all the weight of a feather bed. It pushed off my turban, which unwound at my feet. That was when I formed my plan of escape. Lying down alongside one thorny talon, as thick and rough as a log, I tied myself securely to the Ruk's claw, using the cloth of my turban. Then I went to sleep to escape the pains of fear in my heart and the pains of hunger in my stomach. I woke up in time only to wish that I had stayed asleep. The Ruk had risen off its egg and was climbing a furlong with every beat of its wings. The eggs below soon looked no bigger than a white bean. The whole island soon looked no bigger than a pea. I wished to commend my life's good deeds to Allah so that he might be merciful to me, but I could remember lamentably few, so I vowed to behave much better if Allah in his mercy would grant me the opportunity. Still the bird soared higher until I thought it must roost among the beams of the sun. The air was so thin that my lungs shriveled to the size of walnuts, and the blood abandoned my head. I regained consciousness just as the Ruk swooped down below the rim of a black canyon and glided down into a valley. "Oh, Allah is truly merciful," I cried. "He saved me from the gulf of the ocean and from the vault of the sky, and has set my feet on solid ground again." Fumbling at the knots of cloth, I rolled away from under the Ruk and bundled together my turban. "Oh, Allah is full of subtlety," I shrieked. Was a drowning too good for Sinbad, or starvation too merciful? Was it not bad enough to be eaten by the Ruk? Was fate preserving me for this miserable pit? For everywhere I looked were bare black rocks, and the sides of the canyon were sheer. Between every rock and strangling every border, huge black serpents scoiled and writhed about. The Ruk which had brought me to this pit of despair stretched out its grotesque head and snatched up a serpent as though it were a wriggling worm. Then, with the scrabbling of gravel, it ran forwards and took off, spiraling up to the narrow blue slit of a sky a mile above me. It scarcely interested me, but indeed it was not gravel which the Ruk scuffed up. Everywhere, but everywhere, the ground was sprinkled with precious stones. Diamonds, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies, more treasure than even the greed of a young Sinbad had ever imagined. And shall I tell you, friend, my only thoughts at seeing this undreamt of wealth? I wept because the diamonds hurt my feet to tread on. These hideous land serpents rippled as hugely and shined as blackly as were as many as the swelling waves on a night sea. The roots of my soul shriveled, and I fell on my face waiting to be swallowed, strangled, or poisoned by their licking fangs. Just then, I tell no lies, but believe me if you can, a slab of raw meat fell on my head. A serpent is crawling over me, I thought, praying for a quick death. But as the juices trickled through my hair, I decided that I was in fact wearing a side of mutton. Perhaps it was a hint from Allah that I should eat hearty before I was eaten. So I crawled out from under the meat, only to be narrowly missed by another side of mutton bouncing down the canyon wall. Have you heard the rumor, friend, of a place called the Valley of Diamonds? Well, I can vouch the place exists. There are indeed merchants who grow rich on the diamonds, but they dare not climb down among the snakes. Instead, they pitch slabs of raw meat into the ravine. The diamonds and so forth become embedded in the meat, and the giant Ruks, hunting for food, fly down and carry the mutton out of the ravine. Let my story tell you what happens next. When I realized what was happening, I gathered up as many jewels as my pocket would hold, crawled back under the slab of mutton, and clung onto it as mortal man clings to life. A Ruk came hunting for food to feed its chick. I and my meat were lifted off the ground in the grip of its giant claws, and soon the serpents in the valley looked no bigger than the bloodworms in a barrel. The bird carried its food to a nest in the crook of a mountain ledge. It immediately began tearing at the meat with its gruesome beak and pushing pieces into the pink gullet of its chick, a creature as big as a cow. One peck slashed open my chest. The next would certainly rip out my heart. "Oh, Allah!" I cried. "Did my mother's care and my father's money make me fit for nothing but to be breakfast to a baby Ruk?" Just at that moment, an avalanche of rocks tumbled past the ledge, and a great din of shouts and hoots and above frightened the ruck off its nest. One solitary merchant lowered himself on a rope to the ledge and began prodding the meat. "There are no jewels there, my good fellow," I said. At the sound of my voice, the merchant leapt backwards. At the sight of me crawling from under the meat, he fell on his knees and began praying. I suppose I was not as clean as on the day my mother bore me, caked in sea salt and bird lime, and red from head to foot with meat, juices, and blood. "Forgive me, friend," I said, "for I know that cleanliness is close to Allah's heart. But if you would be so good as to help me off this unpleasant ledge, I would willingly share with you the treasure whose weight so discourteously prevents me from getting to my feet." So saying, I fainted, quite overcome with hunger, weariness, and pain. I received from the merchant the most precious of all his gifts, hospitality. He fed and cared for me, and only grudgingly accepted half my immense riches. He found me buyers for my diamonds, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies, and when I was fully recovered, he directed me to a coastal harbor where my new-found wealth brought not just one ship but a whole fleet. Unfortunately, not one captain among those who sailed in and out of the harbor had heard tell of Baghdad. Imagine it, friend, that some of the islands of the world have drifted on the winds and tides so far from the world's center that the inhabitants have never heard of Baghdad. I sent the fleet in all directions, one following the Dog Star, one the Pole Star, one the Pleiades, and one the Red Planet, with instructions to trade at every port until they found knowledge of Baghdad. I myself boarded the ship with the richest cargo, opened the sails fully, and ran before any and every wind, for who sends the wind but Allah? "Who sends the wind but Allah?" I crowed, sighting an island one morning. But the captain said, "Some devil sent this one," and he bent his head onto the wheel and wrung his hands. He ordered the sails to be reefed in, and the ship turned to put the island behind us. But no sooner had we turned than a pirate ship rushed down on us. We lay between ship and shore with not an inch of sail blowing. The captain recognized both the island and the approaching ship, and he cursed his fate for bringing him to those waters. I begged him to tell us why he was lying full length, beating the deck with his fists. I begged him to tell us what to expect, but he only moaned pitifully and said, "Expect death, young man, expect to die." "But what am I thinking of?" said Shahrazad, breaking off suddenly. "I have told you the story of the first voyage of Sinbad, and now I presume on your patience to tell you the awful events of the second voyage." "Don't interrupt the story with your chattering," said King Shahryar. "Go on, go on." "But your courtiers are knocking at the door, my most eminent and conscientious lord, and I still owe you your rightful wedding present, my little head in a silver dish." "Worthless woman," said Shahryar, stamping to the chamber door. Opening it, he shouted at his startled chancellor, "Do you know the story of the second voyage of Sinbad the sailor?" The chancellor fell on his face in the doorway and kissed the carpet between the king's bare feet. "Forgive me, my most powerful and intellectual lord, but I cannot truthfully say that I do." "You see," said King Shahryar, turning on his wife, "are you suggesting that I go without the second voyage of Sinbad rather than keep my own headsman waiting? I forbid you to leave this room until I have come back tonight and heard the story." "Oh, patient and even-tempered husband," said Shahrazad, "forgive my lack of judgment, for I am only young and foolish. To hear you is to obey." King Shahryar dusted his hands together with satisfaction and strode downstairs to his audience chamber, while, outside in the courtyard, the old wazir walked fretfully up and down, and the royal swordsman sharpened his sword. Chapter 4. Sinbad the Sailor's Second Voyage. "Be quick," said King Shahryar the next night, throwing himself down on his bed alongside his wife. "Sinbad's treasure ship is trapped between pirates in some dreadful island. Why was the captain so terrified?" "Ah, well," said Shahrazad, "he knew the stories about those waters, but I ask myself who had told him the stories, for no one had ever escaped alive from the island of cannibals." "The island of cannibals," whispered the king, savoring the fear that slid down his throat like a raw muscle. "Tell me, Shahrazad." "Not I, but Sinbad must tell this story," said Shahrazad, "for surely I can know nothing of such terrible things." The pirate ship was manned by a crew of dwarfs, wizened yellow little men whose fathers were surely monkeys, for they swarmed aboard like a pack of chattering apes. They stood no higher than a man's thigh, but they bit and scratched and leapt on us from the rigging, where whole hordes of them swung about, shrieking and jabbering and baring their long yellow teeth. Our clothes and skin in tatters, we huddled together on the stern, powerless to fight these darting, treacherous ape-men with our slow fists and short, feeble cutlasses. They took control of the ship, let out all the sails, and steered us at full speed for the island, to give it its true name, the Isle of Zug. In the shallows they carried us ashore, 4 or 5 ape-men supporting each sailor. Then, as the last of us was thrown on the sand, they all leapt aboard our ship and drew away from the shore. Allah be praised, I said. They may have been the most ugly creatures living, but at least they did not kill us. They were obviously thieves of mercy. Oh, Sinbad, what kind of fool did your parents feed and educate? Did I sit on that beach and call those ape-men thieves of mercy? They were no more merciful than the housewife who puts cheese in the traps to feed poor hungry mice. Behind the beach stood a towering fort surrounded by a high wall. Facing us was a gate worked all in ivory, which stood half open, so we went inside and looked about. We saw no one, friend, and nothing but for a few cooking pots, as huge as horse troughs, some barbecue skewers longer than spears, and a few broken benches. Littering the desert courtyard were several hundred white bones, put out for the owner's dogs, or so we assumed. As no one answered our greetings, we curled up in our cloaks and slept, and I, believing that my greatest misfortune lay in losing my cargo and ship. Fool that I was, fool that I was. At sunset we were woken by the earth shaking under us. The ivory gates swung fully opened, and a grotesque giant shuffled in and bolted them behind him. His head could only have pleased his mother. His cheeks hung down to his chest like a camel's dewlaps. He was as bald and tusked as a walrus, and the folds of skin under his eyes would have made hammocks for sailors. His ears dragged over his shoulders, and he barked a great deal, dragging his knuckles along the ground so that his nails, like 2 farm harrows, plowed up the soil. The giant lit a fire, sat down beside it, and then looked us over thoughtfully. We were no surprise to him. The monkey men had simply made their regular delivery. A barricade of fat fingers trapped me against a wall and rolled me in his fat palm as though I were a sweetmeat. The giant poked and prodded me, but as I was still thin from my earlier shipwreck, I did not please him. Instead, he picked up the fat ship's cook between finger and thumb and cooked him on a spit over the fire, crunching him up with obvious satisfaction and spitting out the larger bones. Almost at once he fell asleep for the night, leaving us desperate with fear but unable to climb the high, smooth wall of the fort. Every day was the same. The giant went out in the morning, bolted the gates, and came back in the evening with a ravenous appetite. He would choose the fattest sailor from the crew and roast and eat him barbecued for supper. "Oh, Allah, decider of fates!" we cried out, legless with terror. "Could you not have let the ship founder or be swallowed by a whale? There is no way for a believer or native of Baghdad to meet his end. We should have thrown ourselves into the sea when we first saw the pirate apes." In short, it seemed time to act. There were only a handful of us skinny sailors left. I suggested that the giant would soon start eating us 2 at a time. "In order to defend ourselves, we must attack," I said. "But first we must know our escape route. Let's tie these benches together into a ladder and be ready to climb the wall tonight." That evening, after the ship's second lieutenant had satisfied the giant's hunger, we watched the ugly brute settle down to sleep, and when we crept to the fireside, hauling 2 of the skewers across the coals, we heated their points white-hot, and carrying them as undertakers carry coffins, we ran at the head of the sleeping cannibal. His snores blew our turbans off, but on we charged and plunged the white-hot spits into his red-rimmed, blue-lidded eyes. The boatswain fell into the giant's cavernous mouth as the cannibal let out a yell like doomsday. We were thrown in all directions as the grotesque beast staggered to his knees and slapped the ground, trying to squash us like flies. Before he could not see us, we were able to lean our makeshift ladder against the wall and climb out, pulling the benches over behind us, for they were to serve as our raft. But we had no sooner pushed off from the shore, paddling with our hands, than a female giant, with the same dewlap cheeks, ears flapping as she ran, appeared on the beach, leading the blinded cannibal by the hand. Truly the sight of them was so repulsive that the shallow shoreline waves wrinkled up their noses. The giants stood howling at us from the beach, baring their fangs and barking as great black conger eels bark on the hook. Then they picked up boulders and threw them at the raft, swamping it with pitching waves and smashing some of the boards. Only 3 of us were left clinging to the raft when it drifted beyond the range of the falling rocks and limped out into the open ocean. For a day and a night we watched for land until our eyes were as dry as pebbles, and then we slept. "Wake up! Wake up!" I cried shortly before dawn. "The sea's as still as milk and a cat's saucer. We must have entered a lagoon." Lying on our raft, we waited for the sun to tell us what kind of land the sea had brought us to. Little by little it lit a circle of scaly coral which totally enclosed the raft, so that I could not tell how we had sailed inside. I was remarking on the multicolored scales of the reef when the sea monster, whose coils had surrounded us, lifted its multicolored head and sipped a sailor off the raft. Round and round its coils writhed, spinning the raft in a whirlpool of snake. At night it was hidden by darkness, but its loud hissing made us long to hear waves breaking on Arabian beaches before we met our end. In the morning I was all alone. The sea serpent had licked my last companion off the deck and left me one more day in which to praise Allah. It seemed time to act. I tore up the benches from the edge of the raft and raised wooden walls and a roof so that I was floating in a lidded wooden box. "At least, if I am to die," said I, "Sinbad will have a respected coffin as befits a believer." Round and round the sea snake wheeled, spinning the crate in a whirlpool of serpent. Then in the night it nosed me up and down, hissing like a punctured elephant. But truly it found Sinbad and his coffin an indigestible meal, and swam off by first light to wreck the ships of believers and unbelievers alike. May Allah grant it a short life. My flimsy box was sighted by a merchant ship. The sailors mistook it for a crate washed overboard from a cargo ship, and were greatly amazed to prise open the lid and find a creature of my kind inside. The sailors did not press me for my story, and I rested below decks for several days, interested only in eating and sleeping, though they told me that I cried out in my sleep, "O Allah, maroon me on the island of Zug if I ever see Baghdad again and do not stay home to grow old." "The captain is from Baghdad," said the second mate, "but we won't be docking there again. He will have to sell the ship at the next port we come to. Times are bad in shipping, and he is nearly ruined." The sailor shook his head disappointedly. "And they say the captain has a rich cargo waiting in a Baghdad warehouse, but he won't sell it in case the owner comes back to claim it. Come back from the dead after 7 years. Sinbad won't come back. He went down with a whale to the kingdom where only fish can breathe." I dropped from my hammock and begged them to take me to the captain. The old man did not recognize me at once, but I remembered his face so well as the ship pulled away from the whale island, and his voice shouting, "Aboard, aboard, or you are all dead men!" And I was so grateful to the good captain for keeping my cargo that I gave him half its value and one of the ships that had found its way back from the far distant Diamond Valley, for I am almost embarrassed to tell you what wealth awaited me at home. My friends, the trade winds, had shepherded my scattered fleet from Basra harbor, and where the cargoes had been sold for more dinars than can be counted on an abacus. The captain came to visit me here when he was in port, bringing stories from the liquid mountains of the sea where there are as many wonderful beasts and fabulous islands as there are trees in a forest. I was tempted, Allah forgive me, to set sail again on other voyages, and I met with other adventures. "But I have stolen too many moments from the span of your life," said Sinbad the sailor to Sinbad the porter. "May Allah reward you and all those who have an attentive ear and can listen with their hearts to an old man's stories." Sinbad sailed on 5 more voyages, my attentive and unsleeping lord. Shahrazad slipped from the bed and began to dress, for bright morning stood in the window, and the royal swordsman stood in the courtyard below. I wonder how many ears have heard him describe the fight between the great rhinoceros and the elephant. "Shahrazad, aren't you afraid of the swordsman?" her husband interrupted her. "No, my lord," she answered with honesty, for in her heart of hearts she had no fear of the swordsman, only of his sword. She continued to dress quickly and cheerfully. "Shahrazad, aren't you even afraid of death?" She looked at him with her head on one side. "O fearless, long-lived king," she said, "I know that death is huge and ugly and threatening, but so was the jinni in the tale of the fisherman and the bottle, and you know how that story ended." Shahryar searched the library of his memory for the tale of the fisherman and the bottle, but For who but Shahrazad could know that the story was as new as tomorrow, a half-hatched story with scarcely a word to fly on? No, Shahrazad, I have questioned my heart, and it claims not to know the tale of the fisherman and the bottle. Oh dear, said Shahrazad, opening the door onto the staircase. Poor heart. Wife, said Shahryar, his temper flaring up, I do not like there to be stories lying around in this kingdom without me knowing them. Come back tonight and tell me the tale of the fisherman and the bottle. The swordsman can wait another day, I command you. To hear you is to obey, said Shahrazad, and turned another way along the corridor.